What would you do if you looked out at 15,000 people and realized one of them was crying alone? Not from joy, but from something much older and much heavier than that. Sam Cooke didn't think about it. He just acted. It was March 7th, 1962. The Municipal Auditorium in Nashville, Tennessee was filled to its last seat. 15,000 people had come from across the state, some of them driving 3 and 4 hours on dark country roads to see the man whose voice had been coming out of their radios for the past 5 years like something that didn't quite belong to the ordinary world. Sam Cooke. 26 years old, already a legend, already the kind of performer that other performers talked about in the particular hushed tone reserved for people who are operating at a level you cannot entirely explain. The night had started the way those nights always started, with an energy that was almost unbearable. The crowd already on its feet before Sam Cooke reached the microphone, the noise in the building less like applause and more like weather. He had opened with "Twistin' the Night Away," and the whole room had moved, 15,000 bodies finding the same rhythm without being asked, the way crowds do when the music is right and the performer is someone who genuinely knows what he's doing. By the third song, Sam Cooke had the room exactly where he wanted it. That's when he saw the man in the fourth row. His name was Edmund Gaines. He was 53 years old, a retired school teacher from a small town called Gallatin, about 30 miles northeast of Nashville. He had been blind since the age of 19, the result of an accident at the factory where he worked summers during college, and in the 34 years since, he had built a life of considerable quiet dignity. Teaching history at the county school for 22 years, raising 2 daughters with his wife Loretta, learning to navigate the world through sound and memory and the particular spatial intelligence that develops in people who cannot rely on their eyes. Edmund had loved music his entire life. It was, in many ways, the organizing principle of his existence, the thing that had gotten him through the factory, through the hospital, through the long adjustment period that followed, through every difficulty that came after. He had a record player at home that he treated like a piece of sacred furniture, and on the shelf beside it were albums arranged in an order that only he understood, organized by feeling rather than by artist or genre. Sam Cooke's records were at the far left of the shelf, the beginning of everything. His wife Loretta had bought the concert ticket as a birthday present, pressing it in his hand 3 weeks before the show with a smile he couldn't see but could hear perfectly well in the way she said his name. She had wanted to come with him, but their younger daughter had come down with a fever that morning, and so Edmund had made the drive to Nashville alone, which was something he did more often than people expected and more capably than they imagined. He found his seat with the help of an usher who took his arm at the door and guided him to row 4 with professional efficiency, and Edmund sat down, folded his cane across his knees, and waited. He heard the crowd arrive around him. He heard the low roar of 15,000 people settling into their seats, the sound of programs being opened, the particular collective murmur of anticipation that has its own distinct pitch, different from the murmur of a crowd that is bored or a crowd that is afraid. He heard the lights go down, or rather, he heard what the lights going down sounds like when you cannot see it, which is a sudden collective intake of breath followed by a shift in the noise that is almost impossible to describe, but completely unmistakable once you know it. And then Sam Cooke walked out, and the sound that went up from the crowd was the kind of sound that Edmund Gaines had never heard before in a concert hall, though he had been to many. It was enormous and specific at the same time, the way a very large fire is both enormous and specific, and Edmund felt it in his sternum and his teeth and the backs of his hands. He listened to the first song with his eyes closed, which was habit, and his hands folded in his lap, and his face very still. He listened to the second song the same way, and somewhere in the middle of the third song, a slower number, more intimate,
Sam Cooke pulling the room down from the frenzy of the opening into something quieter and more serious, Edmund Gaines began to cry. He wasn't sure afterward exactly why. It wasn't sadness, or not only sadness. It was something more complicated, the accumulation of things, the way music sometimes catches you at the precise intersection of who you are and who you used to be and who you are not going to get to become, and opened something up that you have been keeping carefully closed. He thought about Loretta at home with their daughter. He thought about his record player and the shelf beside it. He thought about the factory and the summer he was 19 and the particular quality of afternoon light on the last day he ever saw anything. He thought about all the concerts he had been to over the years and the way he had experienced them through sound alone, building pictures in his mind from the music and the crowd noise and the feel of the room, and how those pictures were always incomplete in a way that he had long since made his peace with, but never entirely stopped noticing. He didn't make any noise. He simply sat in his seat in the 4th row with his white cane across his knees and tears running quietly down his face, and to anyone watching him from a distance he might have looked like a man who was very moved by the music, which was true enough as far as it went. Sam Cooke was watching from the stage, and he was watching carefully. This was something that people who saw Sam Cooke perform in those years consistently remarked upon afterward, the quality of his attention. He was not a performer who looked over the crowd or through it. He looked at it, specifically, the way a person looks at individual faces in a conversation rather than at the general shape of the room. It was one of the things that made 15,000 people each feel simultaneously that he was singing directly to them, because in some meaningful sense he was. He was taking them one at a time, registering them, and then incorporating what he saw into what he did.
He saw Edmund Gaines in the 4th row. He saw the stillness and the cane and the tears on the man's face. And he saw the thing that was harder to name but impossible to miss once you had noticed it, the particular quality of aloneness that surrounded Edmund in that crowd, not because he was unfriendly or unwelcoming, but because he was experiencing the concert in a fundamentally different way than the 15,000 people around him, and that difference had its own kind of solitude built into it. Sam Cooke finished the song he was singing. Then he set the microphone back in the stand, said nothing to the band, nothing to the crowd, and stepped off the stage. The reaction in the auditorium was immediate and confused. The band exchanged glances. The crowd noise shifted into something uncertain, people turning to their neighbors with expressions that asked whether this was part of the show and receiving shrugs in return. A murmur moved through the room like a wave, starting at the front and rolling all the way to the back wall, and in the time it took that murmur to complete its journey, Sam Cooke had walked down the steps at the side of the stage, crossed the floor in front of the first 3 rows with his hands in his jacket pockets, and stopped in the aisle beside Edmund Gaines. He crouched down next to Edmund. Edmund heard him coming, heard the footsteps, the change in the ambient sound as someone moved close to him, the slight displacement of air. He turned his head in the direction of the presence beside him, which was a reflex, and then he heard Sam Cooke's voice from approximately 2 feet away, very quiet, nothing like the voice that had been filling the auditorium a moment before. "Hey," Sam Cooke said. "You all right?" Edmund was quiet for a moment. He was not an easily flustered man. 22 years of teaching teenagers had cured him of that, but this particular situation had no precedent in his experience, and it took him a beat to locate the appropriate response. "I'm fine," he said. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to—" "You didn't do anything," Sam Cooke said. "I just wanted to check on you." The 15,000 people in the auditorium had gone almost completely silent, not because anyone had asked them to, but because something was happening that none of them entirely understood yet, and the instinct in the presence of something you don't understand is to get quiet so you can hear better. Word was passing back through the rows.
He got off the stage. He's in the crowd. He's talking to somebody." And people were standing on their seats and craning their necks and passing the information back to the people who couldn't see. Edmund Gaines told Sam Cooke that he was a school teacher from Gallatin, that his wife had given him the ticket for his birthday, that he had been listening to Sam Cooke's records for years, that the music had meant a great deal to him over a great many years, and that he supposed hearing it live had caught him off guard in a way he hadn't entirely anticipated. Sam Cooke listened to all of this without interrupting. Then he asked Edmund one question.
Have you ever heard a whole concert before? Not just the music, the whole thing, the crowd, the room, all of it together. Edmund considered this. I hear it differently than most people, he said. I suppose that's true. Sam Cooke was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Come up on stage with me. Edmund's response was immediate and reflexive. I couldn't do that. Why not? Edmund opened his mouth and then closed it again, because when he went to locate the reason, he found that the reasons he had were not as solid as he had assumed. Sam Cooke waited. He was, by all accounts, a very patient man when patience was what the situation called for. All right, Edmund said finally. Sam Cooke offered his arm, and Edmund took it, and they walked together down the aisle and up the steps at the side of the stage, and the sound that went up from 15,000 people as they watched this happen was not a cheer exactly. It was something that included cheering, but also included things that are harder to name, recognition and relief, and the particular emotional response that occurs when you watch someone do something that you know is right and that you would not have thought to do yourself. Sam Cooke walked Edmund to the center of the stage and positioned him so that he was facing the crowd, and then he stood beside him. He didn't explain to the audience who Edmund was or why he had brought him up. He simply stood there beside him for a moment, the two of them facing 15,000 people. And then he said quietly to Edmund, Can you feel them? Edmund stood very still. He tilted his head slightly, the way he did when he was listening with particular care, and he was quiet for what felt like a long time, but was probably 10 seconds. Yes, he said, I can feel them. Sam Cooke nodded. Then he turned to the band and gave them a small signal with 2 fingers, and they began the opening of A Wonderful World. And Sam Cooke sang it standing next to Edmund Gaines, his hand resting lightly on the man's shoulder, and Edmund stood there with his face turned toward many people he could not see, and felt the music and the crowd together as a single thing, the sound and the warmth and the presence of all those people. And his face did something that the people in the front rows described afterward in different ways, but that all amounted to the same thing. It opened. When the song ended, Sam Cooke leaned close to Edmund and said something that nobody else heard. Edmund nodded. Sam Cooke walked him back to the steps and helped him down, and a young usher was waiting at the bottom to guide him back to his seat. And as Edmund settled back into the 4th row, the applause that came from the room had a quality that people who were there that night reached for words to describe for years and never quite managed. Sam Cooke returned to the microphone. He stood there for a moment without speaking, looking out at the crowd. Then he said, Ladies and gentlemen, that man right there just reminded me of something I needed to be reminded of. He didn't say what it was. He didn't need to. He played for another 90 minutes. By most accounts, it was one of the finest concerts of his career. Edmund Gaines drove home to Gallatin that night and told his wife Loretta everything that had happened. She listened without interrupting, which was unusual for her, and when he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Did you tell him what his music meant to you? She asked. Edmund thought about this. Not in words, he said. Loretta was quiet again. Then she said, I think he knew.
Edmund Gaines lived for another 19 years, and by his own account, the concert in Nashville on March 7, 1962, remained the most vivid single evening of his life. Not because Sam Cooke had brought him on stage, though that was part of it, but because of the question Sam Cooke had asked him, standing at the center of it. Can you feel them? As if the 15,000 people in that room were something to be felt rather than seen. As if the version of the concert that Edmund Gaines had access to was not a lesser version, but simply a different one, with its own textures and its own truth. He kept the concert program. Loretta had picked it up from his seat and saved it without telling him, and she gave it to him later that week, and he kept it in the drawer of his nightstand for the rest of his life. He couldn't read it. That wasn't the point. Some things you hold on to not for what they tell you, but for what they remind you of, which is that the world is larger and stranger and more generous than you had remembered, and that sometimes, in the middle of an ordinary evening, someone looks out at 15,000 people, finds the one who needs to be found, and does something about it. If this story moved you, make sure to subscribe and hit that thumbs up button. Share this with someone who needs to be reminded that being truly seen by another person is one of the rarest and most important things that can happen to us. And tell us in the comments, have you ever had a moment when a stranger saw you in a way that changed something? We read every single one.